Hi, my name is Marcy Theoret, and I'm going to be walking you through the backwards design model in a flipped classroom design format that was used for marketing fundamentals. Just want to take note that this is not the perfect design, and the purpose of this video is just to provide you with an example of what students may have seen and kind of what to expect in a lesson to give you some comfort and support as you're developing your lessons. So let's start off a little bit with the flipped classroom. I always like to think that what the flipped classroom is not at first. The flipped classroom is not simply a way to save an hour in the in-class time by making the students do readings and homework and things like that before class and then take it up during class. Its purpose is really to take an intentional activity and make it work. The flipped classroom is not necessarily easy, but it can work and it can provide a very rich learning environment for the students. So, what is flipped? So, the flipped classroom in the BBA incorporates a collaborative and cooperative learning environment. It incorporates some problem-based learning and it provides active learning for the students based on their unique learning style. A typical BBA classroom is different than a traditional classroom. In the traditional classroom, you have a lot of the sage on the stage activity taking place, and that's not happening in the BBA flipped classroom. It starts with a bit of pre-work. This is usually a student's first exposure to any of the material, whether it be via video, textbook readings, other material, a case study, whatnot, that the course lead has provided. There might also be some activity in that pre-work that helps prepare for what is going to happen in class. In the in-class sessions, the students are now practicing and applying what they're doing. They're typically doing this through discussions, through small groups, projects, case studies, some sort of experiential activity, presentation, and so on and so forth. So it's meant to be a very active type of class. Now, most of us that are teaching learn in a particular way where an instructor will say, everybody open your books or everybody read this case study. And most of us would do it. But research shows that our students are different. The type of students that show up in a Sheridan classroom are different. And their brain thinks that when the teacher says everybody do X, that we're not talking to them. And they're not doing it on purpose. That's the way that their brain has actually been trained and developed over the years. But they do engage in small group activities and experiential activities and all of these things that we've been trying to incorporate into the BBA in order to activate their brain. I read about this theory a couple of years ago and learned about it, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So I tested it in my own classroom, and I was amazed at the results of these small workshop-based, hands-on approach. And so I became a devout follower of that model. It really does work, but it must be intentional for that in-class work. This again is not the instructor being the sage on the stage, but we're walking around the room and we're assisting students in their development and in the learning. Before class, they prepared themselves, and then during class, they're becoming more active in the learning. But we've also got to sort of wrap that up and tie everything in their post-class work. And this might vary in the typical BBA flipped classroom. It might be some of the post-class work might be actually in doing what we would consider to be traditional homework, just to reinforce that learning. It could be very different. It could be actually the production of a video or the resolution of a case study or some kind of group project. Or it could be a quiz or another type of assessment. All of the different types of learning models in the post-class work may vary, but it is important to keep that in mind and keep that intentional as you're developing the class. The pillars of Flip in the Flip classroom is really a framework in order to make it a little bit easier for the instructor to be able to adapt to a new model of teaching. So, the first element in the Flip is to be cognizant of that flexible environment. You can definitely prepare your class and your lesson, but also prepare for any in class modifications of this prepared content if content tends to go in a different direction based on the feedback and the interaction of the student. As an instructor, it's important to be creative in your approach, what you're doing in the classroom, and to use all of the resources in the classroom. If your plan is to do something on PowerPoint or with a video and the technology just doesn't seem to be working, then you need to be flexible enough to adapt on the fly. The second element is learning culture, and this is where we're really taking a look at the approach of what's happening in the classroom. So that deliberate shift from the classroom being a teacher-centered learning environment to a student-centered learning environment. Students can then theoretically set their own pace to maximize face-to-face interactions. And as you'll see with an example that I'm going to be talking about related to marketing fundamentals, you'll see how students can easily do that based on where they are in terms of understanding the content. The in-class piece is then meant for that deeper exploration and meaningful conversations rather than everybody learning at the same pace. The third element is intentional content, and this is where we really look at that model of the backwards design and we look at the key content elements that must be covered in the course and then in this particular lesson, and determine which of those concepts are most important and needed for the students to demonstrate their learning. Consider the undergraduate competencies and how we can weave them into each of the lessons. In some cases, we may not be able to cover everything in extreme detail, especially if you're covering, say, 4 chapters from a textbook. But look for ways that you're able to cover that material possibly in a different way, um, or really looking at the big picture, looking at those different learning strategies, Socratic, peer instruction, problem-based learning, and so on and so forth. And then the last element is the professional educator. So we're seeing a lot more videos being used in order to disseminate information and content and to reinforce what the students are reading in the textbook. But videos do not replace educators. That face-to-face time is invaluable to the students because that process itself provides this interactivity, the exploratory nature. It covers so many of the undergraduate competencies. It helps exhibit and demonstrate good behavior for the students. That is now the role that we are taking on in terms of the flipped classroom. An instructor should also be mindful of providing appropriate feedback based on their observation and doing that in a timely manner. As educators, we should also be aware of our own being reflective in our own practice and commitment to being continually improving our teaching. So now let's get into the backwards design. After attending a session similar to what you're doing this week, while I was developing the Marketing Fundamentals course, we kind of came up with a framework that incorporated many elements of the BBA, the flipped classroom, backwards design, undergraduate competencies, and reflection. And the result that you see here was sort of a proceduralized approach and that we used to work through each lesson with an iterative approach. So in this example, what I've done is I've color-coded the main areas so that you can see as we go through the sample lesson where they've been intentionally included. So now let's get into the actual lesson. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the lesson very briefly, and I'm going to focus on where I sort of activated those 6 areas of the BBA backwards design. So I start off every week with this slide, this kind of pie at the beginning of every class to set the stage to where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. And that, in a way, serves as sort of that consistent bridge for the students. Then I always get into what we're going to be covering today. So today's topic is talking about the marketing promotional mix and integrated marketing communications. The learning outcomes are available for the students. This is also available on Slate. So this provides the bridge and the learning outcomes. Now I do not provide this slide for the students, but I'm giving it so you can get some context as to where the students are coming from. So their pre-class work for this particular lesson was to read 4 chapters. That's a lot of reading. I use the McGraw-Hill LearnSmart technology, and I've picked out sort of those big pieces, the main concepts that I want them to cover, and that is done through that LearnSmart technology, and it's more of a guided reading that they're to go through. So I've roughly assigned about 15 to 20 minutes per chapter with this guided reading and some questions that are incorporated into that technology. So it should take them about an hour to get through just that reading. So number 1, they read the chapter. Number 2, I've provided them with a link to a video and they need to watch that video. Then also through the textbook website, they complete a pre-class assessment. And I should mention that this pre-class assessment, I've included questions that are more application-based rather than content memorization. I do have an assessment, an overall assessment for, or an evaluation component for all of these assessments, and this one in particular is 1.5% of their final mark. The students are also asked to bring in a copy, from a newspaper, magazine article, some kind of flyer that they got in the mail, a link to an image or a commercial, or some kind of example of what they would consider to be a successful promotional ad. We're going to be doing an activity based on what they bring to class, but the intent is that they are to come to class with that ad already thought of and able to discuss. And I estimate that the amount of time it would take to complete this pre-class work would be probably about 1.5 hours. Okay, some students might do it in a little bit shorter time, and some might do it take them a little bit longer. But anyways, that's what they're coming to the class with. So I just wanted to provide you with an example of one way to bridge. In the previous week's in-class assignment, students were asked to solve a case study and provide a break-even point. This was tied to the learning outcomes. A strong majority of the class mistook one of the pricing components, so I felt that I needed to plan this slide to discuss it at the beginning of the next class. So this is an example of using assessment as part of the design. This is also linked to the previous week's learning outcome, which was determining a break-even point. Our first activity of the day with the new material was a video. This video was actually not in the pre-work, although there was one that was in the pre-work. And I chose this as a learning strategy to show this video in the class rather than use it as pre-work because I had prepared discussion questions to ask that will help me formatively assess their understanding of the material. The content of this video is linked to questions that fulfill a number of the learning outcomes. And then using the same learning strategy of the question discussion, it activates 2 of the undergraduate competencies that I've identified as core components in the course: critical thinking and communication. For this discussion, at the beginning of the class, they're at fairly low levels of that competency, but throughout the class, these will continue to be developed through the lessons and the activities. We continue our discussion using this figure from the book as, again, a learning strategy and a bridge. It is a bridge between both the pre-work and content from previous weeks. And we can spend 5 to 10 minutes just on this slide and continuing to talk about it in terms of the video that we showed previously. So then very early on into the lesson, we come to our first in-class activity. So, bridging into their pre-work, we ask them to bring a successful ad. And then they're given a handout. I use it actually in Slate rather than a printout. That's the learning strategy. And we have a discussion and a presentation of some of these ads that follows. So during that 15 minutes or 20 minutes that we'll be going through this activity, I'm walking around the room and I'm quickly assessing what they have done. I'm assessing their understanding of what they're doing with the handout. I'm determining whether or not they actually did bring a successful ad to class. So all of this is going on in a formative manner. These are all linked to the learning outcomes and undergraduate competencies, again, critical thinking and communication. And looking at the actual assignment, there is a question on there that asks them to reflect. Okay, so these are intentional reflection questions. Okay, so the students don't really realize that they're doing all of these things because it seems very natural. And at the same time, I'm walking around the room making sure that all of these things are happening. We continue our discussion based on the learning outcomes and different strategies, using their ads as an example. Okay. And again, continuing on with the learning outcomes and some of the learning strategies, and an example that would there would be pointed questions that I would be asking them based on the product life cycle. Okay. So now we get into our next activity. So this is the video that they were asked to watch during with their pre-work. So the bridge is based on their pre-work. And I have questions, some of them that are listed here, some that I keep in my in my lesson plan to make sure that I can accurately assess what the students have learned from watching that video. And they're tied to the learning outcomes and to the undergraduate competencies. So I just wanted to make a small note here. In this slide, there is an actual link to the video. And there's a reason why I did that. The first time I taught the course, almost all the students in my class would do the pre-work. So a great majority of them had actually watched the video. During our discussion, it was engaging and there were lots of different people that were participating. So this activity went really, really well. But not all classes may be like that one. So the second time that I taught the course, there was only a handful of students that watched the video, and that was pretty indicative of what happened with most of the pre-class assessments and pre-class work. So here I was faced with a dilemma. Personally, I was upset that they hadn't watched the video since it was in their pre-work, but the message in the video was really important. It was important enough for me that I wanted to make sure that everybody in the class understood those concepts. I also knew that the video was short, and looking forward to the rest of my lesson, I knew that I could afford a few extra minutes. So what I decided to do with that second class was to replay the video. So a few people in the class that had prepared for it saw the video, and some people had watched it the first time. My point here is that in many classes you'll be faced with different pre-work situations, and this is something that has come up in many of our BBA discussions. Classes where the majority of the students do the pre-work is common. Classes where very few do the pre-work is also pretty common, but most of the time you'll have classes where it's a little bit of a mix of half and half. As an instructor, you may have to decide in the moment how you want to address this. I personally include the videos as part of my learning strategy as a backup. My preference is not to show the video if it has been assigned in pre-work. It sends the message that this pre-class preparation isn't necessary, and if the majority don't do it, I will end up teaching it traditionally anyhow. In reality, there's not enough time to do that in every class, and it defeats the purpose of the flipped learning model. I wanted to share a few strategies that have worked for me when it comes to the pre-class work. Now, please note this is not a complete or exhaustive list, but merely some strategies. The first one is to set the stage early with these expectations. Discuss with them the importance of completing the pre-work before class and continue to reiterate that over the first 3 to 4 weeks of class. I do not reteach what they should have covered in that pre-work for the first 3 or 4 weeks of class. If they fall behind a bit, they can catch up. They aren't going to like it, they're not going to be comfortable with it, but that's okay. They need the message to be loud and clear that says, you are responsible for your pre-work, you need to do it in order to be successful in the class. Most of them will adapt. Some of them will adapt more quickly than others, and those that take a little bit more time will eventually come around. But the material is available for them on Slate, and they need to be responsible for their learning. The second tip is to determine whether or not the content in question needs to be covered in class or even could be covered in class. As in my example for this lesson, this particular video was a critical piece. I knew it was short, and I knew that I had enough time in class to be able to show the video. So I chose to cover it. In other weeks, I was faced with similar situations, and I chose not to replay the video or not to go over a particular concept in class or take up some pre-work because it wasn't as important a concept, or we just didn't have time in class to cover it, and there were other things that we did need to cover that were more important. But in all cases, I reiterated that they should review it again on their own, and they need to come prepared to class. A third strategy is to create small group discussions with randomized groups, meaning not their friends that are sitting at the same table with them, but mix it up a little bit to encourage some mentoring and some student dissemination of information for those that are fully prepared. So this sort of puts the onus on those students that they're going to look bad in front of their peers, which might be a little bit more embarrassing for them than being unprepared in front of the instructor. And then kind of the last tip is to assign marks to the completion of the pre-work. It's not always necessary, and it would be really nice if as students progress through the program that we didn't have to use that. But students themselves have said, if you want us to do something, assign marks to it, and that way we know that it will get done. So these are just some ideas and some suggestions, but ultimately you need to determine what works for you in your classroom and what works with the material that you'll be covering. And then finally, we get into the last activity. So this particular activity is a case study. None of this was part of the pre-work, but it does encompass content and necessary learning from many of the previous week's session. And so there's a bridge with that previous content, like they get the idea that we're building on top. During this activity, and you can see it's a very long one, I make myself useful to the groups. I'll sit down at their tables with them and discuss the ideas that they have in solving this case study. Basically, I act like an advisor to their group. I work my way around the room at least 3 or 4 times throughout the class. So I'll sit down with each group 4 or 5 times. During each of those 4 or 5 times, I'll ask them specific questions based on where they are in the assignment and get them to defend their decisions. In fact, I don't go around and say, how are things going? Let me know if you need any help. This is not an effective tool in order to get them to actually delve deeper into that information. So that kind of intentional walk around is a learning strategy that I have employed. And at the same time, I'm also able to assess where they're at, their understanding of the material from this week and also from previous weeks. So this is where and the instructor's preparation and understanding of the material is really key to enhancing the students' learning. In one class where we did this activity, I had these learning discussions with the groups on many topics that weren't even part of the promotional lesson, but they were required in order for them to understand the case study and to complete their recommendations. So in one group, we went into the library databases and had to look up some information. In another group, they were having some difficulty with positioning, so I got them to draw it out on the whiteboard. And in yet another group, this is all in the same class, in yet another group, they were arguing about what they should do, so I sort of divided the group up and we had this little mini debate. So all of these things are happening during those 4 to 5 times I'm sort of making my way around the room. That's how that learning takes place in the student's mind. They're not learning it into the PowerPoint, and they're not learning it by reading the case study and answering some questions. It's all that application, that pushing them further and deeper. And those are tied to the learning outcomes, the undergraduate competencies, and certainly into the reflection of what worked and what didn't work. And then finally, sort of the end of every class, I have an upcoming topics and activities. This is a bridge for what they can expect to see, what they expect to be doing over the next week, and what is due for class the next week. So I hope that this has provided you with an understanding of how I use backwards design, flipped classroom, undergraduate competencies, and reflection, and use those in the development of the Marketing Fundamentals course, and in particular for the lesson plan for the promotional lesson.